We have a decorative ottoman. It's practically an antique. Beautifully carved, with decorative nails, crafted and adorned with intricate details. The varnish is heavily damaged, so we need to replace the fabric and foam. First, we carefully take off the fabric. To do this, we need to remove the decorative nails. We're making a little hook out of a regular screwdriver, a notch, and we bend it. When we remove the nails, we try not to touch the wooden varnish part so we don't damage it. We just slide it under. In this particular demonstration, we will carefully and meticulously show you the process of removing each of the nails individually, one by one. In certain situations, sometimes, if they are gripping onto something with all their might, we sometimes find it necessary to use a hammer, and with careful precision, we move it towards ourselves, not in a forward direction, but rather in a backward motion. Here they carefully hammered in one nail, and then the next one precisely. And so we went around and carefully and meticulously removed each and every one of the nails, taking off all of the fabric and foam, which are already in complete disrepair. We carefully roll it all up and thoroughly throw it away. Next, we clean up all of the debris, checking the edges for any broken nails and meticulously ensuring nothing is left behind. We pull all of this out to avoid hurting our hands. We're cleaning with a brush, and the lid comes off really easily too. We don't need it for now. We clean it thoroughly and carefully, and then set it aside with great attention to detail. What a beauty! Well, of course, the most difficult and challenging part, we're going to remove the varnish. We're going to remove the varnish mechanically, but we might have to use some chemicals because there are these tiny patterns here that will be really hard to clean off the old varnish with just knives and sandpaper. So let's take a look. I usually use several types of knives. This is the main knife, made of thick steel, sharp and slightly rounded. Here's a knife for indentations too, which we use when there's a rounded surface. We have different types of sandpaper, and even a file can be sharpened for use on some semicircular indentations. So, let's get started. We'll clear away all this debris, the brackets, and then we'll begin cleaning off the varnish. We need to remove the old varnish. On top of the old varnish, if you don't remove it completely, you can degrease it and paint over it, but then the wood's texture will be hidden. In order for the wood texture to remain visible, varnishing is necessary. To block the old varnish, it needs to be removed, because all those damaged spots will still be visible through the new varnish, and the overall appearance won't change much. There are several ways to remove old varnish. Chemical agents are used to cover the varnish. First you scratch it, then you cover it, let it sit for a bit, scrape it off a little, cover it again, and so on. This takes a lot of time. Plus, it's better to work not indoors, or at least wear a gas mask, because these chemicals can be really strong. The second method, it's with a heat gun. The surface heats up, the varnish bubbles up, and then it's removed. There are also some major downsides to this method. First of all, you can only do this outside, and it's best when there's a strong wind blowing, because the varnish actually melts. And the smell is really strong. You can get seriously poisoned. Plus, when it bubbles up and you start to remove it, as it cools down, it starts to twist and turns into a mass that's really hard to take off. So, with all these pros and cons, I've come to the conclusion that it's better to remove it mechanically, specifically using knives in a mechanical way. Not with sanders or rotary tools because they all use sandpaper, and sandpaper gets clogged very quickly when spinning fast over the paint, and the surface of the sandpaper becomes glossy and practically stops working.
Here we can give it a try. Here we take the sandpaper. This is coarse sandpaper, number 60. The effect is almost zero, and the sandpaper has already started to clog. This is by hand, but if you use a machine it heats up and gets covered like glass, and literally in a minute you'll have to change the sandpaper. It's very slow and not effective at all. So these kinds of knives with a short thick blade, sharp-edged and a slight curve. These kinds of knives are perfect for removing paint. But the problem here is that the surface isn't flat or straight. There are patterns, decorative elements and indentations. With this kind of knife, we can mainly remove paint only from flat surfaces. Let's say we start by using this knife to carefully and meticulously remove the paint wherever it can reach. You can see really well here how it works, as much as possible. Just a couple of minutes. From surfaces that are easy to reach, with this kind of specialized scraping knife, the paint will come off really quickly and efficiently. This is particularly true for surfaces like wooden or metal ones, especially since the paint is already quite old, having been applied many years ago, not holding up very well against any form of abrasion or scraping. So if the leg didn't have any decorative elements, we could clean it in just 2 to 3 minutes, and it would have a surface like this. The paint is removed, and the dark stripes are from the stain, the wood stain, or a decorative treatment that soaks deep into the wood. It's practically impossible to remove it completely. Theoretically it's possible, but wood has this characteristic where some fibers are softer and some are harder. When a staining treatment is applied in areas where the fibers are harder, the treatment doesn't penetrate deeply, while in areas where the fibers are softer, it can go in a few millimeters deep. So, it's practically impossible to remove it completely. Based on that, usually when furniture is re-lacquered, it's either done in the same color or a darker shade. Sometimes you can lighten it a bit, but not by much. So first let's go over it again with this knife. Then, for areas that have indentations and curves, like this groove we have here, we use the tip of the knife and insert the knife. We insert the knife and very carefully try to guide it. Right now, unfortunately, my knife slipped and a small scratch appeared that I'll have to fix later on. So, we do it like this, turning the tip and trying to clean as much as possible while minimally damaging the flat parts as gently as possible. Then you can have several sharpened edges on the knife. In this example, we have a shorter one, which is characterized by a stronger curve. We also use this one. Here it fits exactly and perfectly right along the curve, smoothly. We also take it in hand and with these kinds of movements, well, it's a bit awkward on camera right now. Usually you set it up better, put it on a lower table, lower it down and rest it on something with the leg, and then you work. But you can already see how the paint is coming off. After we've gone over it with the knives, we take some coarse sandpaper like this 60 grit, fold it, and then we work on these grooves. We're sanding it down. This area is almost cleared of the old varnish. The most challenging part, of course, is working on this decorative flower. Here we're gently removing the varnish with a straight knife. Where we can't reach, we turn the knife tip towards the light so we can see where the varnish is shining. And with just the tip of the knife, we remove all the shiny spots. It will take a bit more time, but there's really no other way to properly clean such a decorative flower. And simply with the tip of a knife, we remove all the shiny places. This will certainly indeed definitely take a bit more time, but there's really no other way to properly and thoroughly clean such a decorative flower. You can see that we've almost cleaned this part of the old varnish. Just like all these swirls, this takes quite a bit of time. But at the same time, there are advantages to this type of work rather than working with a hot hairdryer. But even with a hot hairdryer, everything still won't come off. You'll still have to pick it out with a knife. And it's also impossible to get into all these tiny details without using a mechanical method. So, we use a sharp knife, make careful movements, follow safety techniques, keep our hands in gloves, and avoid wide movements, especially towards ourselves or our other hand. We make light, short, smooth movements without too much force because the knife can slip and you could injure yourself. And in the end, here's what we have. I've already worked on these details, meaning the varnish is almost completely removed. We can go over it again with coarse sandpaper for all the indentations. So we fold the sandpaper here. It's already worn out. We change the bending point, bend it again, and go into all the indentations, going over them several times. After that, we take finer sandpaper like 100 or 120 grit, and we process everything in the same way. And we check with our hand. The surface should be as smooth as possible, with minimal roughness. Once the entire surface is sanded down like this, we can apply the stain and then varnish it. Another important detail in the technique of using a knife. When you're working with a knife, you shouldn't make movements like this. Any movement for removing varnish should involve bringing the knife to the surface gradually, at as sharp an angle as possible. When working with a knife, you cannot make a movement like this. So, any movement for removing varnish should involve bringing the knife to the surface gradually at as sharp an angle as possible. So, there shouldn't be any impact of the tip on the wood. Otherwise, you'll leave marks on the wood that you'll have to sand down later. So, the movement is done with a gradual approach to the wood and a gradual exit as well. That way, there won't be any marks left on the wood, and you'll have to sand less later. Let me show you again how it's done. We lean it, for example, on the corner of the table. Press down as tightly as you can so it doesn't move. Where the surface is flatter, you can start working with a knife like this. The varnish comes off pretty well, easily and efficiently. It's much faster than using sandpaper. Now we've reached the wood. We make a short movement. If you try to swing your arm from the shoulder, the knife can easily slip and hurt your other hand because you always want to pull towards yourself. It's easier and safer to make the movement away from yourself, but then it's much harder to aim the knife where you need it. It's easier when pulling towards yourself, but the movement should be short. And ideally, you should use your body instead of just your hand. We pull our hand with our body, so if it slips, it won't go further onto the other hand. And when we've gone over a flatter surface, here we have a stronger rounding. We take a more rounded knife. Are you starting to remove the varnish from them? Here's what we have. This particular knife is perfectly designed for smoothly following the natural curve of whatever you are working on. It has a sleek, ergonomic handle that fits comfortably in your hand and a sharp, precision blade that makes cutting effortless. Here's a detailed look at its elegant design and functionality. And it removes the varnish without leaving any scratches on the wood. At the same time, you see, you always need to move the knife along the grain, not against it. The challenge here is that the grain of the lead goes this way. And here we have a joint, and here we have the decorative skirt, where the grain goes like this. So we carefully bring it up to the joint. And we're going to clean this part, like this, along the grain. Again, depending on where the joint is, try not to go over it, because it will be much harder to sand later. Here, when making a short movement, it's convenient to brace with your finger. With these kinds of movements, we're carefully removing almost all the varnish here too, using this specially designed curved knife to get into these hard to reach spots. This tool is particularly effective because it allows us to precisely target areas that are otherwise difficult to access. It's a labor-intensive process, requiring patience and precision, but it's definitely doable with the right technique and tools. After we've meticulously cleaned everything with the knife, ensuring no residue is left behind, we start sanding all the surfaces with coarse sandpaper to prepare them for the next steps. This sanding is crucial as it smooths out the surfaces, allowing for better adhesion of any subsequent layers. Only then, after ensuring everything is perfectly prepped, can we confidently move on to the next stage of our restoration project. Then we carefully fold the sandpaper in half, ensuring a precise crease, and use the sharp corner to meticulously go over all the edges with the coarse sandpaper, which is a 60 grit. This type of sandpaper is particularly effective for rough surfaces. We thoroughly go over all the corners and edges to remove as many splinters as possible, ensuring a smooth finish. This process is crucial to prevent any potential injuries from sharp splinters and to prepare the surface for further treatment or finishing. After we've gone over everything with the 60 grit, we take a finer one like 100 or 120 and sand just the same way. And all the parts are processed this way. And once again I remind you, we go along the grain. Here the grain goes this way, and then we have the leg glued in here. So we sand like this. Make sure to sand carefully and precisely along the grain. That way, the surface will be much more smooth and neater. We check if the knife slipped anywhere and if there are any splinters. We sand down any cuts as much as possible, because when we apply the varnish, if there are any splinters or cuts, they'll stand out on the varnish. So we try to do our best and make it as good as we can. We've completely cleaned it, went over it with coarse sandpaper, then with fine sandpaper, and you can run your hand over it like this to feel if the surface is smooth. If it is, then everything's good. After we've cleaned it, we take a soft, lint-free cloth and wipe down the entire surface to remove the dust. We blow out each leg and every crack to a great extent and as thoroughly as we can manage, because since any remaining dust during varnishing, it will create extra roughness, and we want to avoid that. We've wiped everything down. First, we're going to apply a decorative protective treatment. We'll add colour. We mentioned that since these dark brown stains from the old treatment can't be cleaned out of the fibres because they've soaked in deeply, we're going to use a dark brown treatment as well. In particular, we've chosen the Tigui colour. We're applying the treatment, let it dry for a few hours. Once again, we're using acrylic treatments and acrylic varnishes. They are odourless, non-toxic and very easy to work with. They don't dry too quickly or too slowly, so you have time to spread everything out and make adjustments. You have 15-20 minutes before the varnish starts to set, and after a few hours you can apply the second layer. Both the treatment and the varnish work the same way. We also want to use an acrylic brush, ideally the same as the varnish, but if you don't have an acrylic one, at least make sure it's soft. It's this colour, which is a shade of rich and warm brown that resembles the colour of chocolate. We take a brush, dampen it a bit, and start applying everything. You can poke the brush into the grooves like this to make sure it gets in there and doesn't leave any bare spots. The great thing about acrylic varnishes and treatments is that you can just slather it on with the brush and then make the final stroke along the grain, and it lays down really nicely. We cover everything step by step, making sure to hit all the spots and grooves. First we go around in a circle and also follow the grain. Here the fibers go like this, and then we have the leg, so we'll go down along the leg. Next we have the skirt, and we'll apply it along the grain as well. The great thing about this treatment is that you can adjust it. You can add more, touch it up and spread it out. You can go along the grain or even across it. The main thing is to finish by going along the fibers in the right direction, and it gives a really beautiful, nice finish. It highlights the texture of the wood very well, and the furniture will turn out really beautiful. Whether you go along or across, the main thing is to finish by going along the fibers in the right direction, and it gives a really beautiful, nice finish. It really highlights the texture of the wood, and the furniture will turn out very beautiful.
we went all the way around. Then we just flip it over and take turns carefully and meticulously covering each and every single tiny little nook and corner and cranny. We start from the spot where we left off, because if it dries too much, the seam might stand out a bit, and we don't want that. If you've covered one side and then the other, make sure to go over the corners with a light, soft touch, ensuring that no corner is left uncovered. And again, we make sure that everywhere is thoroughly covered, so there are absolutely no light spots left. This way, we cover all the legs, ensuring that every single spot is covered with utmost care. So, we're finishing up the coating. We definitely need to check all the seams. When you examine the pattern, focus on the corners. These spots often hide details crucial to the design. After checking, gently spread the pattern with light strokes to keep it intact and even. This ensures the pattern is well checked and beautifully shown. We spread it along the grain. Let's double check everything all around. Some places start to lighten up faster, slowly. The density of the wood varies. In some places, particularly in certain areas, it blended in more quickly. We're also carefully looking at the brush strokes to make sure there are no marks left behind. Well, when drying, the impregnation becomes a little lighter. Then we'll see if we need it a second time. No. For now, we're leaving it to dry like this for a few hours. After a few hours, it will take on its color and everything will be clear. So, enough time has passed, the initial stain has dried, and now we're applying the varnish. We're applying the varnish using the same principle we used for the staining, with light strokes along the grain, making sure to cover all the patterns. Just like this, we push the varnish where it needs to go, and then with gentle movements we spread it out smoothly. And here we have everything else already covered with varnish, resulting in this kind of surface. After the varnish dries, we need to let it dry well. Once it's completely dry, we take some fine sandpaper and lightly go over all the rough spots, and then we apply the varnish again. So the varnish has dried. After that, when the varnish has dried, the surface that seems smooth becomes a bit rough again. You can feel it with your fingers. Why? When the varnish dries, unsanded wood fibers rise and become noticeable. Use finer sandpaper, like 240 grit, and lightly sand areas we touch often. Don't worry about sandpaper marks. They'll be covered by varnish. We're just smoothing rough spots. We take some sandpaper after the varnish has dried, using a finer grit, like 240 for example, and without pressing too hard, we lightly sand in the areas where we usually touch with our hands. We sand along the grain again. Don't be scared if a few marks from the sandpaper appear. They'll be well covered by the varnish, but we're just removing the remaining rough spots. Here, these kinds of movements are quite enough. The surface becomes very smooth. We wipe it down again. We take a soft lint-free cloth, wipe it down, and then we apply the varnish again. Alright, we've wiped everything down thoroughly and well. You can also carefully blow out these areas to make sure there's absolutely no dust left inside the intricate patterns. Because if there's dust left when you apply the varnish, that dust will also create bumps and rough spots. We wiped it down well and blew it out. And just like before, we're applying the varnish again using the same principle. We'll apply the varnish and let it dry for a few more hours. Then we'll start working directly on the soft part. The varnish has dried and we have a very beautiful, shiny and smooth surface. In the next step, after that, we securely and carefully attach the plywood. After this, we securely and carefully attach the plywood with precision. We pour the glue. We align it very neatly and carefully pour it exactly and gently into the designated cutting area with precision and accuracy. A few points on the chest. A few additional points can also be secured with 12 staples. We ensure that the surface is thoroughly pressed down and securely glued, making sure every part is adhered properly. After this, we nail it down firmly. Then, we take the prepared, precisely cut round foam and carefully apply glue to it. This step is crucial to ensure that the foam is attached perfectly, without any gaps or loose edges, providing a smooth and even finish. We're going to make it 8 centimeters here. We carefully pour glue on the edges and in the middle of the surface. This is done to ensure that the foam adheres properly and securely. We then spread the glue out evenly to the very edge, making sure that the foam sticks as close to the edge as possible. This helps to prevent any gaps or lifting at the edges. In the middle, we spread the glue to ensure that the foam doesn't shift around or move out of place. It's important to note that you don't need a lot of glue for this process, just enough to cover the surface lightly. There's no pulling force here, so excessive glue is unnecessary and could lead to messiness or uneven application. We carefully place the foam. We gently check the gap with our fingers with precision. We don't press it down from the top so that it can be shifted. We check to make sure the gap around the circle is roughly the same and consistent in all areas to ensure accuracy and precision. This helps maintain uniformity. That's it. After that, we press the foam down from the top. That's it. Indeed, the floor is glued down. We cover all of this with synthetic protective padding, additional protective layers and materials. We carefully trim the synthetic padding in a circular manner, ensuring precision along the edge. This process is crucial for achieving a perfect fit and finish, allowing the padding to align seamlessly with the design, maintaining both its functionality and aesthetic appeal. Here we have a groove, right here in the wood. We cut right along it with scissors. We trim it. And the synthetic padding with a little tension. We tuck it around, gathering it just a little, slightly more like this into a fold. Then the fabric will carefully smooth it out.
It's better to turn it over for this. This is how we turn it over. And we hammer right into the groove at the edge where the decorative nails will go. First, for instance, you can take a little bigger step and then pull the synthetic padding straight up carefully and gently with ease, with just enough tension so it doesn't tear. It should perhaps look something like this, and then we go along the groove with scissors to trim off the excess. This is basically how we eliminate all the excess. Here's what we end up with. Then this will be covered with fabric, and there will be decorative nails. We perform this action meticulously all around the entire circumference of the circle. After completing this process, here is the result that we have achieved and ended up with. Everything has been done neatly. Now we start working with the fabric. So let's get started with cutting the fabric. Here we have a round pouf, which is a versatile and stylish piece of furniture. We make the top part with rope stitched as edging. Use a flexible measuring tape. Place it at the trim's edge and lower it, making it about 11-12 centimeters for the circumference. Measure 145 cm, cut to 148 cm. Sew the skirt to fit snugly on the pouf. Here's how it looks folded. This is how snugly we can sew it. We check how much we need for the fold for the edging. We place it at the edge where the trim should go and lower it down to the edge, taking into account the fold, meaning we can make it about 11-12 centimeters to create the circumference. Again, it's easiest to use the flexible measuring tape. We put it on snugly, pull it tight, and see that it measures 145 centimeters. We cut it to 148. Then, when we sew it in a way that the skirt fits snugly onto the pouf. So, we've already cut this piece, and here's what it looks like if we fold it. This is how snugly we can sew it. Next, it's a bit trickier to make a neat circle. This is how tightly we can sew it together. Next, it's a bit trickier to make a neat circle. You can just lay it down and draw it, marking on the back of the fabric, for example, using a marker to create the circle. But it will probably end up being very uneven. So, how do we make the circle as even as possible? Of course, you can just lay it down and draw it, marking on the back of the fabric, for example, using a marker to create the circle, but it will probably end up being very uneven. How do we make the circle as even as possible? We take the flexible measuring tape again and measure what our diameter is. Our diameter is exactly 46 centimeters, and we add some extra for the seam. We add to 1.5 centimeters. So if our diameter is 46, we add 1.5 centimeters on each side, which gives us 3 centimeters, making it 49. Now we need to draw a circle that's exactly 49 centimeters. The easiest way to do this is to take a piece of cardboard. On one side, we make a small hole that a regular needle can fit through. Then we divide our diameter in half. Since we have 49, we need 24.5 centimeters. We measure from this hole and make a larger hole at a distance of 24 centimeters. This is our radius. We roughly calculate where the center of the hole will be. So we have some extra fabric around the edges. We insert the needle. So we have a sort of compass. We take a marker. In this step, we take our drawing tools and carefully draw a circle. This requires a steady hand and attention to detail to ensure the circle is smooth and even, capturing the essence of our design.
Don't press too hard so the fabric doesn't shift.
To create a perfect circle, we start by drawing a precise outline on a piece of paper. This is achieved by using a compass, which is a tool designed specifically for this purpose. The compass consists of two arms, one with a pointed end to anchor it in place, and the other with a pencil to draw the circle. We carefully adjust the compass to the desired radius, ensuring that the circle will be the correct size. Once the circle is drawn, we proceed to cut it out. This step requires a steady hand and a pair of sharp scissors. We follow the line meticulously, making sure the edges are smooth and even. After cutting, we have a perfect circular piece of paper. The next step involves stitching the edges together. This can be done using a needle and thread, or a sewing machine for a more professional finish. The stitching should be tight and secure, ensuring that the circle maintains its shape. To aid in this process, we use a piece of cardboard as a backing. The cardboard provides stability and helps keep the circle flat while we work. A ruler is also handy to measure and mark the stitching points, ensuring they are evenly spaced. By following these steps, you can create a reliable and accurate compass, perfect for drawing circles of any size with precision and ease. Let's check one more time just to be sure. Let's see exactly how much we have for the fold by feel. So the binding will be approximately right around here. The fold we have is 1.5 centimeters. Basically, you can make it smaller, you can leave it at 1 centimeter. It will take a little for the tension. But now we move on. Let's take a moment to determine the best approach for our project. So, let's begin the process of stitching. First, we need to prepare the skirt of our cover by gathering all necessary tools and materials. This preparation ensures that everything is in place and ready for use, setting a solid foundation for the rest of our cover creation step. According to our calculations, it's about 1.5 centimeters. Let's do the stitching. The sewing machine is old, but it works. I've been consistently working on this machine for over 20 years and tirelessly. And before that, who knows how long it worked. I wouldn't be surprised if we're about the same age. We've carefully stitched it, and now we take our poof and then try it on. The skirt should fit very tightly indeed, in fact. So there shouldn't be any excess. So when we put it on, you can see the edge here, meaning this part should fit snugly. So it should be tight. So right now it's stretched, but we can even stitch at least 1 more centimeter. This is to make the foam compress a bit and to ensure that this part fits as tightly as possible. Otherwise, if it's loose, when we start tacking and pulling it, it will end up wrinkling. To make the foam compress a bit and to ensure that this part fits as tightly as possible. Otherwise, if it's loose, when we start tacking and pulling, it will end up wrinkling. So we can even make it tighter. The main thing is that we can stretch it and put it on, so we can even make it tighter. The primary thing is that we can essentially pull it on and put it on. So we sew in another centimeter and then we will sew in the piping before we start stitching the pieces together with the piping. It's really important to understand if the skirt will match the main piece in terms of circumference, if they'll align, or if we'll end up with a fold like this when we finish the stitching, which we won't have anywhere to hide. To do this, we've stitched the skirt, put it on tightly, and then we turn it inside out. We also insert the main piece inside out and check if we made the right allowance when stitching to see if we're hitting the edge correctly. So, we've stitched the skirt, put it on tightly, and then we turn it inside out. We also insert the main piece inside out and check it. We need to see if we made the right allowance when stitching, if we're hitting the edge correctly. We lay it out evenly, check it, and then we tuck it in like this. Did we make the proper allowance when stitching? Are we going to hit the edge exactly when we place it carefully? We check it very thoroughly and then tuck it in carefully like this. We've folded them with the same hem like this, so they should match up. After that, we take a marking chalk or just regular dried soap and start at the seam, making little marks. You might not see them on camera, but we make a mark. And label the first one with an arrow. Then, about every 10 centimeters, we make marks on the skirt and on the fabric. Start stitching from the first mark. Adjust fabric to prevent puckers or shortage. Check alignment every 10 cm. Redraw marks if needed. And we pull one fabric or the other accordingly so that it follows the marks. That way, at the very end, when we finish stitching, we won't end up with puckers. Or on the other hand, we won't find ourselves short on fabric. So, visually, everything matches up. But when you're sewing, the fabrics can stretch a bit relative to each other. To avoid any puckering at the end, we can check every 10 centimeters or so to see if the pieces align all the way around. Then we take a look to make sure all the marks reach the very edge. If needed, we can redraw them so they're clearly visible, and we can use them as a guide. Now we can start stitching. When needed, we carefully draw them in to make them clearly visible, allowing us to navigate with ease. This ensures they stand out, preventing confusion and defining our path. By highlighting each aspect, we rely on them as guides, moving forward with clarity. Now we can start stitching. So, here we've placed our pieces under the machine. So first we inserted the cord with a little extra length. We made a hem on the flat piece, on the skirt, with a little extra length. Then we aligned the first mark that we labelled, with a number or an arrow with the seam, placed it under the machine and inserted the needle. And next we have a mark on this piece and a mark on that piece. We check if they align, and we keep stitching all the way around while keeping an eye on that. So, we've marked how wide the hem will be and how much seam allowance we have. Now we start by securing the seam. We're checking if they align. So we keep stitching all the way around and keep an eye on it. We've marked how wide the hem will be and how much seam allowance we have. Now we start by securing the seam. And we started stitching, checking periodically. Here, everything aligns, so we keep sewing. Aligning all the different elements and components of a project or task is not the simplest endeavor one can undertake. It requires a great deal of patience, attention to detail, and a methodical approach to ensure that everything fits together seamlessly. Despite the challenges and obstacles that we encountered along the way, we have been able to make steady progress. Through consistent effort and determination, we have gradually managed to bring all the pieces together and complete the task at hand. This process has been slow and meticulous, but ultimately rewarding as we see the final product taking shape. I won't lie. Didn't all come together right away. I had to adjust it a bit, so when I got to the seam there was a bit of a pucker. In that case we just start ripping it out as we go and keep stitching, giving ourselves a bit more seam allowance, and gradually we ease out that pucker. I had to stitch about another 15-20 centimeters, increasing the seam allowance, but gradually we got to a normal seam. Now in this step we're going to carefully apply the technique we've discussed. The question arises, how exactly do we take it out? To do this, we need to follow a specific method. We gently place it in the designated position like this, ensuring everything is aligned properly and securely, like this. We spread it out as flat as possible so that the seam goes down, and slowly and carefully, we gradually pull it tight all around with utmost care and attention. We put it on like this and then we pull it tight little by little. We talked about giving it maximum tension so that when we staple it later, the fabric doesn't bunch up in wrinkles. There is a certain difficulty in this, but it looks like we have succeeded.
Everything turned out pretty well for us. The edge is nice and even, and we don't have any extra wrinkles anywhere. And when we staple it, the fold here will be about 2 centimeters. This is how we pull it. And the edge will be precisely right along the border, exactly where it should be. Alright, now we can fold it over and staple it all around. So the cover is ready. Next we start upholstering. We turn it on its side. We need to carefully determine and assess how much of a fold we should make so that the edge is pulled evenly and uniformly all around the entire perimeter. To do this effectively and efficiently, we stretch the fabric in such a way that the edge goes a little below the plane of the seat, ensuring a smooth and even finish. Literally approximately 5 millimeters to 1 centimeter, and we check how much fabric has gone below the edge where we will be stapling. Here we have about 2 to 2.5 centimeters or so, and that's how much we fold and staple. The spacing between the staples is roughly about 1 centimeter in total. We carefully flip it over and gently pull it tight opposite this spot, making the same fold precisely. We stretch it precisely and meticulously in a careful manner and staple down 2 or 3 staples with utmost precision. We will now proceed by continuing our process, starting with a crisscross pattern. This involves moving in a diagonal manner, first one way and then the other, ensuring that we cover the entire area thoroughly and systematically. This method helps in achieving a uniform and consistent result, which is crucial for the success of our task. We pulled it tight to the other side. So as you can see, we have 4 tight points, and we'll use those carefully, precisely as our guide to continue stapling around the edges. Where we have the seam, we spread it out to the sides and fold this part over too, and we staple it just like all the others. So slowly and steadily going around. As we continue on our path, we reach the end. Once we've upholstered everything, we take a look around. We check to see if the edge is pulled evenly all around. Maybe it's pulled a bit too loosely in some places. For example, in this spot it's a little higher. I'm going to pull out a few staples here and tighten it up a bit more. And let's move on to the next part of the work. So we've carefully finished the upholstery, and the very last step, so to speak, is to finally cover it with these beautifully decorative nails, and precisely with great attention to detail. How is this done? For this we will need nails, these needle nose pliers to pick up the nail, and a small hammer to hold it like this. And hold it like this. And a small hammer. The head of the nail is 12 millimeters in diameter, so we need to estimate a distance of about 6 millimeters, so that the edge of the fabric is visible below the nail. This way, the edges of the fabric are visible below the nail, and the nail doesn't hit the wooden part, otherwise it will damage it. So that the edges of the fabric are visible below the nail, so that the nail doesn't hit the wooden part, otherwise it will damage it. So we take 12 millimeters, divide it in half, and we get about 6, a little over 7 millimeters. We're nailing in the first nail. So we can see that a little bit of the fabric is slightly visible just below the nail. And then for each subsequent nail, you can also make various tools, drill holes in them to position the nails accurately, or do some preliminary marking. It's not very simple, but it's possible. So we can just take a ruler, place it down, and measure out. Ideally, we want the distance between the nails to be about 1 millimeter, so that a little bit of the fabric is visible. The nails have a diameter of 12 millimeters, so we measure out 6, which means we leave about 7 millimeters from the nail and mark a point every 7 millimeters. This way we mark out the distance from the wood as well, which is also roughly calculated. Well, when you have a bit of experience, it's better to practice on something before doing the final piece. So take a sample piece, just try nailing by eye, and gradually you'll be able to do it. You can do some preliminary marking, or you can take a piece of cardboard, make holes in it at the required distance, place the cardboard down, make dots through the holes, and then nail according to those dots. That is, take some detail, just try to hammer nails by eye, and gradually you will be able to do it. So you can do some preliminary marking, or you can take a piece of cardboard, make holes in it at the required distance, place the cardboard down, make dots through the holes, and then nail according to those dots. So there are several different ways to do this. For example, you can make a vise like this. We place it down. Through it we make small dots with a pencil, carefully and meticulously rolling it, and then we precisely nail into those dots. It's long and labor-intensive, but sometimes it's necessary, if we want everything to turn out as neat and precise as possible. So we have dots on the fabric in exactly the right places, and we're nailing the nails in there. This work doesn't go as quickly as I'd like, but here you just need to be a little patient. Sometimes nails can get pulled a bit off course along the wood grain. So in this case, this nail has been pulled up a bit. We carefully take the claw, gently pull it out, and in this small hole we can use a regular match or a small stick, and we carefully drive it in there with precision and care, ensuring it fits snugly, using a steady hand. In this scenario, here's a typical game match that is being played. We sharpened it and drove it into this hole. In this situation, the nail has been inserted at a point that is too elevated, which can cause issues with stability and alignment. To address this problem, we need to carefully extract the nail and then focus on filling the resulting hole. This can be effectively done by using a small wooden matchstick or a slender piece of wood. Insert the matchstick or stick into the hole to fill the space adequately. Once the hole is filled, you can then proceed to drive the nail back into the correct position, ensuring it is aligned properly and securely fastened. This method helps in maintaining the integrity of the structure and ensures that the nail holds firmly in place. We trim off the excess, so we take an awl or a sharpened large nail and make an entry point for the nail just below the matchstick. We insert it, and now it has gone in a little lower and is in line with the others. We insert it and now it has gone in a little lower and is in line with the others, thus marking, somewhere by eye,
somewhere by moving, we hammer decorative nails around the entire circle. Sometimes a little nail might get misaligned, but usually this kind of work is viewed from a distance, and from that distance any gaps or imperfections of 0.5 millimeter aren't noticeable. Plus, this kind of work gives off the feeling that it was done by hand, not by machine, and from that distance any gaps or imperfections of 0.5 millimeter aren't visible, especially since this kind of work gives off the feeling that it was done by hand, not by machine. Naturally, since it's done by hand, there might be some small flaws, but actually they don't stand out. This is how we go all around. So specifically, we're carefully and meticulously upholstering with nails in this particular project. You have to nitpick, as I have already mentioned earlier on. Like I said, by eye, leave about 1 millimeter at the bottom and ideally 2 millimeters between nails. We chose individual nails for handmade work. We aim for even spacing, though close inspection may show differences. From a distance, these are unnoticeable. If a nail shifts significantly, we remove it. There are nails that come in strips, whole strips, or in segments of 10 centimeters, and they line up perfectly. But the nails we've chosen are only individual ones, so this is true handmade work. We try to make it as even as possible. Upon closer inspection, if you use a ruler or get really close, you can see that there's a slight difference in the spacing between the nails. But from the distance that people usually look at furniture, it will be completely unnoticeable. If one of these nails, for example, has shifted a lot, then we just remove it. When you pull it out with the claw, often the head bounces off. If one of these nails, for example, has shifted a lot, we just take it out. When you pull it out with the claw, the head often bounces off. We take it out and do it right next to it. When you pull it out with the claw, the head often bounces off. We take it out and do it right next to it. It's shifted a bit to the left and down. Let's move it a little to the right and up, just a bit more to ensure it's perfectly aligned. We're making a spot for the nail, carefully marking the exact position, and we drive in another one, making sure it is secure and stable. Oh, this one turned out nice and straight, just as we planned, and we keep nailing all the way around. It's indeed a slow process, yeah, it definitely takes a bit of time. In some cases, some nails have to be carefully pulled out and redriven back into place, but overall, in the end, this is the kind of work we've ended up with.